I am looking at a picture of Alexander Fleming. Everyone knows him. He is the man who discovered penicillin in 1928 when some mold accidentally fell into his petri dish. I used to think that was the whole story. I thought the moment he saw that mold, the world was saved from infection. But I was wrong about what saved us. Discovery is one thing, but making enough to matter is something else entirely. Now, think about that. Fleming found the mold in 1928, but the antibiotic age did not start for another 15 years. If the cure for infection was sitting in a dish, why were people still dying of simple scratches and pneumonia all through the 1930s? It is because discovery is not the same thing as a drug. Fleming had a clue, but he did not have medicine. He could not figure out how to pull the active stuff out of the mold or how to keep it from falling apart. For a decade, penicillin was just a lab curiosity that almost everyone forgot about. This is where a group of researchers in Oxford come in. In 1939, Howard Florey and Ernst Chain dug up Fleming's old research and realized the world had ignored a gold mine. They were not just looking for a cool observation. They wanted a weapon against infection. They figured out the chemistry to pull the penicillin out of the mold and prove it worked in living bodies. I think about their first big test. They gave it to mice, then eventually to a human, and the results were incredible. But here is the problem. They had proof, but they had almost no supply. To treat one person, they were using every container they could find. Bedpans, milk bottles, anything that could hold a little bit of mold. It was a start, but it was not a solution. You see, proof of a miracle does not mean much if you can only perform it once or twice a week. To understand why this was so hard, I want you to picture something simple. Imagine you have just invented the perfect recipe for a loaf of bread in your home kitchen. It is the best bread anyone has ever tasted. You have the secret written down, and you can make exactly one loaf at a time in your small oven. That is what we call discovery. You have found the answer, but now imagine there is a massive famine, and you suddenly need to feed 1 million people by tomorrow morning. In that moment, your kitchen recipe does not matter much. You are looking at a problem that your kitchen was never built to solve. You have the truth, but you do not have the scale. Now, imagine you must feed an entire army. Your little kitchen oven will not work. Your small bag of yeast is not strong enough. You need massive vats to mix the dough. You need a different kind of yeast that grows faster, and you need a production line that runs 24 hours a day. This is where the story shifts from a discovery in a lab to engineering for the whole world. To save the millions of people dying of infection, the world did not just need a recipe. It needed factory-scale brewing and a much stronger biological culture to act as the engine. The miracle was becoming a production system story, which is a much harder puzzle to solve than just stumbling onto a lucky plate. That is exactly what happened with penicillin. Fleming's original mold, the one from the famous 1928 accident, was what I would call a weak producer. You see, the mold naturally secretes penicillin into the liquid it grows in, but this specific strain was only making a tiny amount. It was just enough to show the phenomenon in a petri dish, but it was nowhere near enough to save a human being. If you wanted to treat a single soldier, you would have needed thousands of those milk bottles I mentioned. The original miracle just was not efficient. This was the central biological problem. The yield was far too low for large-scale medical use. It did not matter how many factories you built if the biology itself refused to cooperate. The mold was the bottleneck. So how do you fix a biological system that does not want to cooperate? In the early 1940s, the effort moved to America, where engineers at a lab in Peoria, Illinois, tried something new. They stopped thinking about bottles and started thinking about brewing. Instead of growing mold in shallow layers, they built giant tanks. Some held 7,500 gallons. They pumped in oxygen and used a secret ingredient called corn steep liquor, which was basically a high-energy soup for the mold. This was deep tank fermentation. It changed everything because the mold was not just sitting on the surface anymore. It was growing through the whole volume of the tank. Suddenly, the system could think in tons instead of drops. It was a massive leap in fermentation engineering that made industrial scale possible. But here is the problem. You can build the biggest, most advanced factory in the world. But if the organism inside those tanks is a lazy worker, you are just wasting your time. That was the situation in 1943. The technology, those massive deep tanks, was finally ready. But the biology was still lagging. We had the vats, but we were still using a strain of mold that just did not want to produce enough penicillin. It was like having a high-performance race car with a lawnmower engine inside. So the researchers started what sounds more like a treasure hunt than a science experiment. They began searching for a new biological engine. They asked people from all over the world to send in samples of soil or moldy food, hoping to find just one strain that was naturally gifted at pumping out penicillin. It was a desperate search, because while they were hunting for a better mold, the war was still going on, and people were still dying from infections we already knew how to cure. If only we had enough of the drug. This leads to a part of the story that most history books skip over. In 1943 in Peoria, Illinois, there was a lab assistant named Mary Hunt. Her job was simple but tedious. She had to go to local grocery stores and markets to find moldy produce. She became such a regular sight that the locals nicknamed her Moldy Mary. One day, she spotted a golden colored cantaloupe covered in a specific kind of mold. She brought it back to the lab, and when the scientists tested it, they realized they had found the exact answer they needed. This specific strain produced about 200 times more penicillin than Fleming's original mold. Think about that. The most important biological turn in the whole history of medicine did not come from a famous scientist in a tower. It came from an obscure lab assistant holding a piece of rotten fruit. She was the hidden hinge that allowed the whole industrial machine to finally start working. Once they had that specific mold, everything changed. This was the moment when biology and engineering finally clicked together. By taking Mary Hunt's high-yield strain and putting it into those massive deep tank fermenters I mentioned, the production did not just grow, it exploded. In early 1943, there was not enough penicillin to treat 100 people. But by D-Day, in June 1944, the factories were churning out billions of doses every single month. I think about the scale of that shift. The drug reached the troops just in time to fundamentally change the survival rate of wounded soldiers. The miracle drug was not just a miracle anymore. It was an industrial reality. Now, the life-saving scale was finally real. So why have you not heard of Mary Hunt? This is a classic problem in how we tell stories about science. And I have noticed we often prefer a simple lie to a complicated truth. We love the lone genius narrative because it is easy to remember. In 1945, Alexander Fleming, Howard Florey, and Ernst Chain all won the Nobel Prize. And they absolutely deserved it for discovery and proof. But the people who figured out the production, the engineers, the technicians, and people like Mary do not usually get medals. Why do some names survive while others vanish? It is because the public remembers the person who saw the miracle. But we forget the people who made it available. There is a reason for this. Science history tends to favor the moment of finding over the long, hard work of making. When we look back, our brains love to compress the timeline. We see the 1928 discovery and the 1945 Nobel Prize. And we assume everything in between was just a straight line, a simple, inevitable victory. But that is not how the world works. It was a relay race, not a solo sprint. Fleming ran the first lap, Florey and Chain ran the second, and the industrial teams in Peoria ran the final hardest lap to the finish line. If any one of them had tripped, the drug would have stayed in the lab as a scientific curiosity, and the myth we tell today would not exist, because the people it saved would not be around to tell it. The viewer sees the myth because we find it easier to worship a spark than to appreciate the engine. But while we were arguing over names, engineering was saving lives. This is where the production story finally lands in lives, not just laboratories. Because of that mass-produced supply, the way people survived injury changed forever. In World War I, if a soldier got a deep infection from a scratch or a shrapnel wound, there was almost nothing doctors could do. You either lost the limb or you died. But in World War II, because those giant tanks and that cantaloupe mold were working, that same infection became a minor problem. It was a fundamental shift in human history. The production story is not just about factory specs and chemistry. It is about the fact that millions of people got to go home because a miracle drug was available when they needed it. Science found the drug, but engineering gave it to the world. This brings us back to hidden people, like Mary Hunt. She represents the invisible link in this story, not a literal secret agent, but the missing step that history tends to compress out of the record. I find her role so compelling because it highlights the exact step we usually forget, the moment a lab curiosity becomes a usable tool. Without her cantaloupe, those giant fermentation tanks would have stayed half empty. Without the tanks, the Oxford team's proof would have been a tragedy of scarcity. Mary is the hinge between the famous science we remember and the actual medicine that saved our lives. So, remember that kitchen recipe? It was never enough on its own. You might have thought penicillin changed the world the moment Fleming saw mold on a dish. But the deeper truth is that the world only changed when hidden people solved the harder problem: how to grow enough of that miracle to matter. The war was won only when someone built the factory, found the stronger culture, and turned a scientific accident into a global supply line. Alexander Fleming found the miracle. But the engineers and Moldy Mary gave it to the world.